Welcome everybody. Welcome everybody, we're very glad to see each of you here. This is the panel discussion, as you see above, about development between model and reality. It's the final event of our lecture series of this term, of our current research issues in heterodox economics. It was a very, very interesting lecture series with guest speakers from Italy, England, Germany, Austria. And yeah, today's our last lesson, a little bit different. Just a short introduction, the whole lecture series and also this event was hosted by the Hochschulgruppe Kritische Wirtschaftswissenschaften. We're a students group trying to critically assess the current economic theory and the way it is taught nowadays. And yeah, if you're interested in our activities, we want to start a newsletter which will be sent to you sometimes. You can put your name and email address on the sheets that are given around. And enjoy.
And we are looking forward to a very interesting discussion on the topic of development, as Johannes said, and its breach between models taught at universities and the reality of development practice. And for this panel, our discussants are, in the middle, Skanja Flechner. She acquired her PhD at the University of Flensburg with a thesis on the role of aspirations on the persistence of poverty. She currently works at the Institute for Latin American Studies at Freie Universität Berlin, and she will join the University of Siegen as an assistant professor for pluralist economics in spring. Then next to me is Sebastian Palmer. Many students will know him, I guess. He's professor of development economics at the University of Göttingen, but also consults as expert for institutions such as the World Bank, UNICEF, and the German Institute for Development Evaluation. He is also director of the Center for Modern Indian Studies at the University of Göttingen, and his studies mainly focus on global health, and he has conducted many randomized controls trials for his research. And to complete the circle, to your left or to my right, Helmut Asche, and he currently is honorary professor at the University of Mainz. For more than 20 years, he worked for the GIZ, the German Development Agency, abroad and in Germany. His focus is on African development, and he was professor for African Studies at the University of Leipzig and founding director of the German Institute for Development Evaluation, DEVAL.
Yeah, and this is Teresa Neef from Berlin. She's currently studying her PhD in equality economics. And my name is Johannes. I'm part of the Hochschulgruppe. And we would like to start with having very short statements, introductory statements by our guests. And we ask them different questions. And we will start with Mr. Vollmer. And our question which we posed to him was to shortly explain what an RCT is, or randomized control trial, and then maybe answer what kind of findings can these RCTs deliver, and what can't they do, and if they are the current gold standard of development economics. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you also to Hochschulgruppe for organizing this Ringvorlesung, which is doesn't work. You can all hear me without, right?
Oh, it's better for
Better? Okay. Thanks to the Hochschulgruppe for organizing this Ringvorlesung, which I think is a very exciting part of the study in Göttingen. So what are randomized trials? Like randomized trials is a type of study design where you take a sample, like a representative sample from a population of interest, and then randomly divide it into a treatment and a control group. By randomly dividing it into these two groups, we make sure that these two groups are virtually the same in all characteristics you can think of, and the only difference in the end is that one receives the treatment and the other doesn't, and therefore the difference you observe between the two groups after giving them the treatment is the effect of the treatment, because in all other characteristics they are the same. You ensure that by randomly allocating them to these two groups. Randomized controlled trials are considered like the gold standard, like in quantitative evaluation, and I think for good reason, because they're conceptually superior to other study designs in terms of rigor and in terms of internal validity. However, one shouldn't overdo it. Yeah, so they provide credible evidence, and having credible evidence is important, but there are also many risks of only doing randomized controlled trials, because you can't answer each and every question with a randomized controlled trial. So there are very many important questions that can't be answered by a randomized trial. So for instance, like the fact that smoking causes cancer, we know, but no one tried that in a randomized controlled trial for good reasons. Or I remember a lecture by Angus Deaton like 8 years ago, where he gave the example like the effect that parachutes like save you when you jump out of a plane. He showed this one picture, Abhijit Banerjee, other one Michael Kramer, randomly allocated a parachute. See what happens. Yeah, so many important things can't be answered with a randomized trial. So that's one limitation. And many areas that are important for people's lives are left out if you limit the evidence to that of randomized trials. So for instance, infrastructure is something that you cannot easily randomize, and these other things, obviously for ethical reasons. Then randomized trials, the way they're typically done, ignore the so-called general equilibrium effects. So they typically assess like, the effect of the trial on one outcome, and but what happens like after that is typically not assessed. That's also a limitation. The third, randomized trials that can also have bias, although they are conceptually superior. They can have problems if they're not done well. So, for instance, like if they are implemented in a way that like the experimenter does not ensure that the participants change their behavior, adjust their behavior because they know they're part of a trial and not because of the treatment. That can also happen. The problem with that is that these biases are not so obvious in the studies. Like, so you typically only know that if you were in the field and if you know all the nitty-gritty details on the ground. And in the paper, you do not necessarily see that. So therefore, although they're conceptually superior, they have these problems. Another issue is the issue of external validity. That you typically conduct a randomized trial in a very specific setting, in a rather small setting, and you get credible evidence for that setting, and we call that internal validity. So they give like the right answer if done well for that setting, but in a different setting, the answer might be a different one. And you might ask, okay, why don't you do randomized trials all over the world, like many times? Well, also for ethical reasons, like once you have shown that a treatment is effective, and one of the ethical principles says that it's not justifiable to withhold like a treatment that is beneficial from the control group. Yeah, so you can maybe do a randomized trial like 1 or maybe 2 or maybe 3 times, but once like the effect is established, you can't do another randomized trial in another setting because it will be unethical. And that's a problem because like maybe the effectiveness of some intervention changes over time. Maybe you had like 3 randomized trials in the past, and then you will not be able to generate another randomized trial evidence again for that ethical reason. And another issue is, and that's related to this point of hidden bias, like, so if you define like science, or if one standard of science is that you must be able to replicate it, then I would say like all of economics is not a science. Because and you can easily replicate the statistical analysis of a randomized trial. So if I give you my data and I will give you my do files, you can replicate everything, no problem. But what you can't replicate is the data generating process. Yeah, so and that's a problem of all economics, of all social sciences, like that it's very specific to the context, to the time, and that if you collect like data today, it will be different from collecting data like in 2 weeks, and it will be different from collecting data in a year. In that respect, we differ from, let's say, physics, where you can replicate things. Yeah? But I guess like, either we accept that we're not a science, or we define different standards for economics of what the standards for good practice are. Hope I stayed in the 5 minutes, and I pass to the
Thank you, Mr. Palmer, for your statement and for being in time. and would like to go on, and we asked Mrs. Flechner which difficulties she sees in the current development economics research agenda.
Okay, let me thank you first. Yeah? Yeah, okay. It's red, but I'm not hearing anything with it.
Yeah, okay, that sounds good. Thank you. Okay, so thank you first for setting up this very interesting this panel. We will see if it's going to be interesting. But thank you for setting up this panel. And well, when you told me that would be my first question, I thought, okay, this is a very big question, of course, for a 5-minute statement. But I was reminded of a quote that I read in an Angus Deaton article, so I'm also mentioning this Nobel laureate in the first 5 minutes. He wrote in a GL paper some years back that past development practice, I'm quoting, is seen as a succession of fads with one supposed magic bullet replacing another. So after you find out that one thing doesn't work, then you go on and look for something else. A process, I'm still quoting, that seems not to be guided by progressive learning. And I was reminded of this quote, and I was thinking if this would be the way that I think about the current problems in development economics. And well, I'm bringing this up because I think that many of the issues that you want to discuss here today relate in some sense or another to this quest for universal magic bullets in some sense. For example, calling RCTs the gold standard for all economics research, which you didn't do, you said that this is not the case, and I couldn't agree more. But I think some people call RCTs a gold standard in a broader sense, and I think this reflects a bit the search for rather universal approaches to development. I want to be a bit more specific and make a few points about behavioral approaches to development, because they have been very prominent in recent years, and I think that some people place quite a lot of hope into behavioral approaches in terms of what they can do in order to alleviate poverty and so on. Behavioral approaches to development seek to identify and understand perhaps behavior of individuals or groups that is not optimal in terms of poverty alleviation or development. Not optimal or suboptimal means in this context that people behave in a way that could contribute to the persistence of poverty or their living standards. For example, when people don't make investments that would have a high return for some behavioral reasons. And of course, it's worthwhile to study behavior that you observe in people, in families, whenever you think that this behavior is detrimental for the living standard or the future prospects of family. Of course, that's very important. Having said that, of course, this is not the only thing that we should be doing in development research, and maybe it's not the main thing. This parallels very much what Sebastian Vollmer said about RCTs. There's many topics that you cannot address when you work with behavioral approaches. You cannot address trade agreements, you cannot address all aspects of climate change, you cannot address industrial policy, for example. So, well, I think that, or maybe there are some aspects in industrial policy.
These two.
Yeah, maybe that was a framing effect because of the panel. So I think that behavioral development economics is really important, but it's really not the main, or it's really not the only focus that we should have, because that excludes many topics. A second issue associated with behavioral approaches relates a bit to questions of effectiveness and of normative constraints. So once we diagnose behavior that is not optimal, we do this because it deviates from rational behavior as it is defined in economics.
what we often do in behavioral development economics is just to diagnose and to say, well, we have a deviation here, we have behavior that's not optimal, but we don't really seek to understand what the motives of this behavior are. So sometimes we stop just at the level of the diagnosis and then try to design an intervention that corrects this behavior without really understanding and questioning what's going on and what's the reason of this behavior. In some fields, this will maybe not be very important, but there are occasions where I think it makes a huge difference whether people have some behavioral motives that give them good reasons to behave in a way that looks irrational from the outside, but maybe not from from inside of the individual. If we just rely on narrow or theoretical models, then we may just not see these meaningful motives. Related to this as a concern that I think we could qualify as normative concern, there are situations, not everywhere, not all the time, but there are situations where we are quite quick in implementing behavioral interventions in the global south. I think we may not be as quick in the global north without really considering what the implications are. You mentioned the general equilibrium effects. There are also some ethical concerns. So I'm bringing these issues up to say, in order to use behavioral approaches as a kind of example to say, well, there's lots of relevant things that we're doing. There are also lots of pitfalls attached to these. And if we want to provoke progressive learning, to use Deaton's words again, rather than just to search for magic bullets, then I think we need to be more careful when thinking about what are the topics that we can address with a certain method, what are the limitations of our methods, of our approaches, and how can we complement each other using different theories, different empirical methods, different topics, and also be more pluralist regarding the people that we involve in research and discussions. Okay, I will close here. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this doesn't work.
No, it does.
It does? Okay, should just speak up. Okay, thank you. And now we would like to turn to Mr. Asche, and we would like to know how development economics, its ideas and theories changed over the past decades.
Okay, let me try this.
This?
Thanks for having me first. I like very much the initiative, but I asked myself if we take our audience along with us. Did you ever talk in one of the earlier sessions about RCTs or so, or otherwise I would frame my own intervention in...
We discussed it sometimes, but it was not a super focus. But one of the focus points was development economics and within RCTs.
Okay. And then let me try to link to this in a way, because otherwise we stumble a bit into a specific method which has its merits and its limitations, as my two predecessor speakers said. It is, let's take these randomized controlled trials as one quite fashionable method to empirically search developmental effects, not only in economics, in many neighboring areas as well. I was, before coming here, specifically asked to talk about development aid, where I have worked for 20 years, and aid evaluation. And if I start from there, then I get down in a minute to wire this specific method to development economics and where it stands by now. I was indeed not very keen to talk about aid and aid evaluation, because having worked for too long in the area, In fact, one of the weaknesses of development aid, and that might have been touched upon, is weakness of independent and scientifically sound evaluation of effects. So that starts from there. And these treatment and control group trials are introduced as one, for some, the one and only method to repair the damage, which they can't, as the two previous speakers have said. Only they can do and indeed produce results in specific settings that are apt to be used for the purpose with these at least two groups that you can compare in the course of the action. When I took over as director of the German Aid Evaluation Institute and actually built it, I was furious that we had never used this method in the German aid system until this institute came up, and even up until now, it is very seldom used in the German aid system, even where it is applicable. It is not applicable in many constellations, as you have mentioned yourself, especially not, for instance, in the area where I worked for 20 years and where I'm still writing about and also working in, that is nationwide policy changes, for instance, which are covering the whole nation and are not easily compared with a controlled situation. This is one. And so on and so forth. I spring to the end of the logical chain. Up until now, we do not know exactly what works in aid and what does not work. We had about 15 years ago or so, 20, 50 years ago, we had an enormous debate that somebody must have mentioned because of these lectures, I suppose, the so-called aid growth and governance debate, where it has been tried to find out why and under which conditions aid of growth, of governance and so on can work or cannot work. The debate, which was largely based on some modeling attempts, ended in a draw. It ended about 12 years in a draw. Up until now, nobody knows quite exactly why and in which constellations aid works and does not work. Conditional on what, unconditional on what, and so on. It was a whole battery. And Angus Deaton, besides, didn't repair the damage. So what I once dubbed the iron law of aid evaluation is still in place, but it is an ironic iron law, and it reads: 2/3 up to 3/4 of all aid projects are a success. 2/3 up to 3/4 of all aid projects are a success. This is obviously an ironic meta-evaluation which points to the fact that we have still an inbuilt weakness of recognizing the causes and effects of aid projects in particular. That has also to do with the lack of political independence of evaluation, but this is a specific governance effect. So that is where I came from, and that is why I'm not very keen to talk about the aid business and its evaluation. Here it is not a very pleasant topic. Underpinning it is obviously the state of development economics at large. As a specific field of science, and that is far more interesting. Again, somebody must have mentioned all along this lecture series that development economics is not a self-explanatory, accepted subdiscipline in economics. It has not always been there, it had disappeared and has kind of come back. The classical piece on that is Paul Krugman. Has somebody mentioned it?
Not that book
Although this, I mean, it's one of his papers of the so-called Odin lectures he gave about 25 years ago, is the fall and rise of development economics. You should have read it. The fall, this is not rise and fall, it is fall and rise. The fall and rise of development economics. And as I have not so many minutes left, actually none, I will just mention which is perhaps the anchor for the pursuit of our discussion here. Paul Krugman, obviously, he is in favor of development economics, and he gives a reason why the science fell and now somehow rises again. And the principal reason for the fall out of grace of development economics until about the turn of the decade before the turn of the century, up until the 90s, was that they are not apt, that the science, especially the classical high development theory, was not capable to cope with the mathematical modeling turn that economics in general took at the time. So that it was largely a normative science to a large extent, and did not cope with the challenge to put these in strict economic modeling terms. But then, and that is the only argument that I need from my end for the rest of our discussion, his paper takes, I read it yesterday evening after years, his paper takes an interesting turn, because he says, then, okay, normally, if we want to deal scientifically with geographically specific regions, developing regions, we have to depart from the usual assumptions of complete competition and from constant or even decreasing returns. We have to talk about increasing returns to scale, also if you want to model, for instance, regional integration in developing regions, and if it makes sense or not, we have to talk about that, but that is terribly difficult to model. He says, so there is an inbuilt contradiction, and my stance on the thing is that this very same problem and difficulties, which he already mentioned 25 years ago as principal problems of development economics, are still around today and still hold up our insights on important developmental aspects and topics. Or slightly more, I suppose.
Thank you. For all three of you, I think now we have a lot of interesting questions we can discuss from these three statements. And before I start with a question, I would like to ask you if you want to briefly comment on the statements of the others, or if I should start.
Maybe one brief comment. So I think like the field has moved quite a bit after the Krugman book, and I think the RCTs were helpful because like the focus on empirical work and like on causal identification like of effects has taken like ideology out of development economics a bit, which I think is a good thing. So we do not have to argue whether or not like there's a poverty trap or no, or whether we have increasing returns to scale. Like we can look at the data and see what they say and then answer the question. You don't have to argue about it. I think that's much better than going into a country, like for instance, like Jeff Sachs did, and then doing it the country with like some ideology you have, and then go out. So rather like focus on the evidence, and I think that has advanced the field a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Potter. That's a very good point for my first question, and that is, we've heard about RCTs, and you said it takes out ideology out of development economics, and we heard about behavioral approaches. And I would like to know how those new approaches in current development economics can contribute to new development economics theory, because I would like to, do we actually need a new theory, and can those approaches contribute to a theory, because RCTs are seen as neutral tools, for example. It's for you and Ms. Lechner, so you can.
And I think it depends what you understand with theory. So if you understand theory as like some writing down some assumptions and then writing down a complicated mathematical model, then maybe no, maybe then the RCTs like can test like the predictions of those models. But for me, theory is also like in having a hypothesis like of how things work, then testing that. And that's for me, that's theoretical work from my point of view. It's in economics typically not understood as like theoretical work, but I understand this as like theoretical work. You know, of course, like the questions you ask, like they might be like shaped or driven by your theory or by your ideology. Like the behavioral example you gave earlier is a good example. So, for instance, like people say, okay, it's irrational that poor people have a television in their home, and that's just like ignorance of like the living condition. Right? If you have not much distraction, then even with limited resources, like it's rational to spend some on fun. Although maybe like for your long-term development, it's better to spend it on food. Yeah, that's not irrational, it's just having more difficult living conditions. And yes, like, so therefore ideology can stay in and theory can stay in, but I think that's how they contribute to developing theory, by answering questions.
Like testing hypothesis.
Let me maybe connect to this example and add one point. I think there's different ways of doing what you described. So we can have we can have hypotheses, or we can even use RCTs to be a bit explorative. And I can imagine a situation where we have many bricks, many different RCTs, and many different hypotheses. I think there's the importance of at some point bringing different insights that we gain this way together, and to kind of just trying to build some theoretical understanding of behavior by bringing different bricks together, rather than just diagnosing deviation. So we could have a long laundry list of what people do wrong and what we should correct, or we should try. And I think your example is really important, because it points to a situation where we are building something like a theory of the motives of behavior. If we achieve to do this with behavioral approaches, then I think that's important, but we really need to do this. If we end up just with a long list of, well, people do this, and this they don't, and we don't know why, but we need to correct it, then I think that will not be very helpful. So I think there's two different perspectives from which we can look at this, and understanding behavior is, from my view, really important.
Thank you. Mr. Ascher, so you said that in German aid and also German research about aid, RCTs are not used or seldom used. What is done instead? And what would be a credible research agenda from your point of view?
Yeah, that is why it is not so pleasant to talk about German aid. You almost forced me to do that. No, because to frame our debate still a bit more perhaps, these RCTs, I mean, this is not heterodox science. It is an established piece of empirical science by now. Also we don't need to invent it. It is terribly important where it is applicable, and it is in many sciences. And good use should be made, despite all the caveats that both of you have mentioned. Full stop. Full stop.
Mm-hmm.
And that a specific aid system is, for obvious reasons, reluctant to follow suit is, as I said, unpleasant. But as for the state of development economics, it doesn't really matter. They are laggards, full stop, again. So that's why I would frame the debate in the following, that I would like to say, okay, here, especially in microeconomic applications at household level, farm levels, and so on, a lot more can be done along these lines, but that is, I think, accepted by everyone who is in good faith and has understood the method. Then we have another field, and I wonder how we can cover all this, rather in macroeconomic problems, where this is rather not applicable, and this is not a critique, it is a fact, where this is not applicable and where there are important gaps that are not covered and closed so far, and I mentioned just one of it, for instance, the absolutely insufficient treatment of the whole area of increasing returns to scale and so on, which has then also outcomes for how to deal with trade policy agreements and so on and so forth. So this just for the framing. For instance, I'm working currently a lot on industrialization in Africa in conjunction with regional integration and trade policy, in particular North-South trade policy. And there, one of the first observations I have to make is that until really 2-3 years ago, we could not even ask about old-fashioned classical high development aspects of structural change in a meaningful way, because analysis of structural change was anathema in a way. It was not fashionable. It doesn't really matter if a country is in agriculture and where in agriculture, if it has industry at all, if it has only services or what. All these economic activities are all equal. So structural economics was neglected until a couple of years ago and have come back only by now. This is the first, is one first important restriction, and it has now revealed, besides that, we have a particular job problem in Africa and so on in a much more meaningful way than we knew it before, and so on and so forth. And the second one is the one I mentioned, that if you want to find out if aspects of regional integration and North-South trade integration are possible and under which conditions, Sebastian has worked about that as well, then you have to do away with some classical assumptions that you have to live with in your economic studies all around. And if I take one example, if you allow, I brought an old paper of Sebastian Vollmer along, where he was asked with colleagues, some of them also still here, I learned, on the EU economic partnership agreements. Some of you might have heard about it. These are the highly controversial trade agreements between the EU and some African regional groups. And in my view, and in the writing I'm now finalizing, you cannot analyze this in meaningful terms if you do not try to incorporate in some way the potential of economies of scale in the regional groupings in Africa, and if they are still allowed to realize these economies of scale after having concluded an agreement with the EU or not. And look what you find in the annex, look which model you find as a workhorse in the annex. It is the simple, it's very small, it's this simple diagrammatic model which you have in all trade policy handbooks, which allows to model the tariffs and also allows to model then kind of regional integration and so on with these usual consumer and producer benefits and losses, Harberger triangle and all that stuff. It is, as somebody has said in a textbook, monumentally unrealistic but pedagogically convenient. And that is welcome. That is why it is still in use. And this is really a frontier where we still are, contrary to RCT, which is fine stuff, and if it is well done, it is marvelous stuff.
On this, I would like to continue and make a critical question. We heard about that RCTs can test hypotheses from older theories. We heard about increasing returns, which I think is very Reinhardt, and we talked about structuralist approaches also. So those are all older theories. So is development economics, especially a theory, actually stuck, or are there new developments? I only saw old ones right now.
Well, this one works, right?
One has to press strongly.
Well, I should have looked up your publications too. So the paper that was cited was done before I got my PhD, and since then I didn't do these things anymore for good reason, because by doing them I realized what we don't know and what the limitations are. Nevertheless, I'm still fine with them. I mean, I never published this paper. The good thing about empirical work is that you can be very transparent about what you do. That's actually true for theory too. Like, so you say, okay, this is the hypothesis I'm looking at under these assumptions, and if you're transparent about the assumptions, it's all good. And if someone dismisses the assumptions you made, that means that the entire analysis and the entire conclusions coming from the analysis are dismissed right from the beginning without looking at any further. So I think that's a good thing. So I think this is an advancement really in the field. Like a lot of economics, like the way it is taught, like in the undergraduate courses, is like that. So that you have like some model of the world, how the world works, and then you stop there. But like the research is different now. The research really looks how things are on the ground, and we have like I think a new generation of like development economists that knows like the realities on the ground really well. So it's not like that people like go and like with like a Western perspective and try to tell people what they should do better. That's not how it works. I'm sure that these examples is still happening, but like broadly speaking, this is not how it works anymore. So you have a lot of people doing development economics that have like a good understanding of the countries they're working on, spend like sufficient amounts of time there, and like really try to understand what the motives of people are and what the needs are, and not enforcing something from outside. I think that's a huge change. I don't think that's like an old thing.
I think we have forces pulling into both directions. I don't think we're stuck. I don't think that we have some very ambivalent parts, and we're turning things around that have been discussed decades ago. There's new stuff. What you could complain about, I think, is that we're not quick enough. So in some respects. So I think it's true, and it's really important that we are having this attempt to be evidence-based and to be on the ground, as you said, and to evaluate policies. I think that's really important. The trade-off is that we might be forgetting macroeconomic and structural things, or that maybe we're not discussing them enough and not having publications enough, because I think my feeling is that the largest share is on micro and behavioral topics, but I haven't counted. So I think that's a trade-off. One thing in terms of topics I'm thinking about that we're not discussing enough is climate change. So we know that we are running into a huge problem. There are people discussing degrowth or post-growth, whether you like it or not. We're not, however, connecting this with development economics, and I think all people in the room want poor citizens of the world and poor countries to be non-poor, but nobody really, I think, has an idea of how the world would look like in terms of CO2 emissions and consumption and so on. And I think if we're being honest, then we really need to discuss this, even if we don't have any clue of how we could solve this problem. And I think that we're making progress in many respects. That's true, but there's also things where we're really not quick enough because we're terribly slow and not even addressing important things. So.
You want to comment quickly on this, Mr. Asher?
Yeah. I try a shorter contribution for a change. I think this is indeed another extremely important area, as well at the macro level as at the micro level, because it is a macro change which has very much micro effects as well. And I will tell you in 2 sentences in which way it affects the area where I am currently working on, which is certainly, or I hope to an extent, covering the lacuna in macro development economics. Africa, if I take this as a typical developing region, sub-Saharan Africa, has no meaningful industry. It had been told for decades it needs none. Especially the Anglo-Saxon mainstream, neglecting all this sectoral stuff and structural stuff, said it. Now everybody discovered that it doesn't work like that. So we are talking very much about industrialization strategies and industrial policies and in the region and so on and so forth, and how it can work. And now, as we are talking, that Africa should have its own network-like manufacturing industry as well, we experience at the same time that the whole thing is called into question by climate change, which makes then a need for green industrial policy and what the catchwords all are, as well in terms of adaptation and mitigation. That is, we have a topic of moving goalposts again. That is catching up in industry, but being told at the same time, folks, it cannot be the same industry anymore. It has to be something completely different. And that is certainly not mastered in theory and empirics so far.
Thank you. We want to touch another point. You worked in Africa in practical aid and development cooperation in Rwanda, in Burkina Faso and Kenya in the 80s and 90s. Which ethical challenges did you face there? Which ethical challenges did you face there in your practical work?
Ethical.
Because Mr. Vollmer mentioned today, researchers are very aware of the situations there. Was it like that in the 80s, 90s, and other positions? Thank you.
I'm not aware of a specific ethical challenge that has not yet been mentioned yet. I marched straight into an ethical disaster in Rwanda in 1994 when we helped creating a situation which led to a genocide, or at least did not effectively hold it up. And I was there at the time when the genocide broke out. And I was in there with my family for the first 3 days, and then we neglected the situation altogether. I'm working very much as the 25th year of remembrance approaches to repair that. One can ask if development cooperation at large has taken all the consequences of this terrible neglect at the time of the true emerging problems that were there. And there will be in the Süddeutsche Zeitung in a couple of days, perhaps already tomorrow or so, an interview with me on the current demographic challenge Africa faces, where we are macroeconomically not up to, and it has, besides a link to climate change as well. So there is another big problem which has exploded at a micro scale, if you like, in Rwanda and Burundi at the time, and which is certainly not analyzed in terms that we can, or politically managed in terms that we can avoid a repetition. I was a bit puzzled by the question of ethical challenges.
Okay. We expected something else, but it's no problem. I think we can continue with a kind of new topic too. We start with Mr. Vollmer this time, and there's come up the idea of the Marshall Plan with Africa. Do you have insights on that, and what's your personal opinion?
I don't have insights, and I think what's wrong with the German development practice and development practice of most other countries as it is done, is that it's like too much centered around the country's self-interest. So some of you may have seen or read studies by Stefan Klaasen, by Inma Martinez, by Feli Novak and others, where they look at the effects of like German aid on German exports to these countries. So like €1 of German aid that increases German exports to these countries by more than €1. So self-interest is a huge problem. And second, like in macroeconomics, empirically, I would say we know like less than 10% of the things, but still we engage like in development practice like on macroeconomics. So I visited like the GIZ office in Cameroon, and the person told me, a good person, not his fault, but no health we're not doing. Like we do growth, like industry development, and we have no idea like how that works. Like really no idea. But still, like we're spending a lot of time, and we like advise like other countries how to do that, and spend like a lot of the resources on that. Then the other things we outside micro. Also there, like the ratio, like what we know, and the money we spend on these things, like is out of control. Like again, like we know some things and we don't know others, but most of the money goes to the things we don't know. And that's what I meant with the advancement in development economics, so that we don't just put out like our opinions and what we think about the world and what should be done and what people should be better, but that we really try to understand like how certain things work, and then one can develop policy based on that. But that's not how it's done. Like money is like put somewhere, like what like is in fashion, and then see what happens. It's really trial and error. She had an interesting meeting with like the farmer family, like in the surrounding area of Göttingen. I won't tell you who it is. And the guy was preparing to do like development, and it's a bit older, must have called like development helper or something at the time. And he had the training, and then in the end, like he decided not to go to the field because he thought, well, we're doing too much more damage than we fix, and really like we're in the developing countries, so we have to change our lifestyle in order for like a change to happen in Africa. And so he became like a small-scale farmer, like doing responsible agriculture, and very much respectable decision. Not saying that all development cooperation is bad, but the priority setting and the political steering and the lack of like relying on evidence and putting the money on the things we know, instead of like randomly throwing at things we don't know and possibly doing harm. I think that's a real problem.
Would you like to comment? Or Mr. Ashley, Ms. Lester?
On this question?
On this question. Otherwise, I will go on.
I wouldn't contradict.
Do you want to add?
I mean, you started with this bloody Marshall Plan, didn't you?
Yes.
Terribly to say that I have some insights about it. Let's put it that way. But it, in substance, adds to what Sebastian said. The last year, this G20 Africa year, in fact, it led to, how shall I put it? It led to a juncture or a junction between something that has been mentioned already, what happened in theoretical development economics and empirical research on structural change or lack thereof, and the labor market consequences in Africa on the one hand, and the political challenge that we all seem to face from the refugee and migration challenge that came up over the last years. And at this juncture, it was politically packed, repacked and repackaged into various overarching plans, over-ambitious, and Marshall Plan is obviously hilarious as a heading for this initiative. But what is correct in all these initiatives, and in the German system we had at least 3 parallel approaches in the development ministry, in the Ministry of Economics and in the Ministry of Finance, and none of these was coordinated by the Chancellery. What is right, nevertheless, in all these approaches is that, as I sometimes nastily put it, development aid does not create jobs, or does not create much jobs, except in development aid. I'm through with almost all important newspapers where I have Entwicklungshilfe schafft kaum Jobs außer in der Entwicklungshilfe. This is nasty, but to an extent it is not a critique of development aid, because I mean we don't want to preach state socialism in Africa or other developing regions. So we don't create factories or we don't create farms by development aid. It's the private sector who is invited to that. So the junction, just to mention that, where these plans are right, despite all these lofty titles and so on, where the initiatives are right, is that they say we have to combine good aid, that is where we know what we do, with more private sector support for investment in Africa, in order to get these jobs where all our structural analyses over the last years have shown that they are lacking by the millions, and that aid is by no means likely to bring them about. That is the true thing. So, interestingly, there is a theoretical stream meeting a political challenge, and something quite fascinating is about to come out about it. Not exactly in this bloody Marshall Plan, where not even one single euro of fresh money is put to it, and so on and so forth.
I add 2 quick. I think this is working. Can I add 2 quick points? So one is, you mentioned that development aid is often linked with interest. I think it's not only interest. I think we even have some trade-offs. If you think of European agricultural policy, if you think of arms exports that provoke conflict, that you then say that you have to fix in a way, or contribute to fixing. I think we even have to recognize that we have trade-offs between different policy fields. So development policy is one thing, and then we have our own economic policies and industry policy. And we also want to protect our industries. We don't want them to compete with new industries from other countries and so forth. So I think that politically we have important trade-offs. That's no secret, but I think we're not considering this enough. And the second thing, because you were talking about problems in development practice, there's one important behavioral advancement consisting in studies that do not only analyze the behavior of people that will be participants of some treatment, but that also analyzes the behavior biases of people who work at the World Bank and development agencies and so on. So we're having some studies, which is, I think, I really welcome this, even though the results are really bad, because they show that people working in the evaluation of projects, for example, are subject to the same behavioral and cognitive biases as all other people in the world. So when they evaluate a project, for example, then their evaluation will be influenced by their political opinion, by ideologies they held. For example, if you study how people evaluate minimum wages, then you will see that, or there are first RCTs indicating that how people evaluate them depends on whether they believe they were good or bad in the first place. So we know that we have this impact of these cognitive and ideological biases potentially everywhere in the field. At least now we can pay more attention to it, which is an advancement.
Thank you. So we heard now a lot of critical remarks that there are new challenges like climate change, and that there needs to be more evidence-based development practice. That's what I heard from you. And so last question I would like to put forward. We see all those challenges and we see that we don't know a lot. We don't know a lot about what works, maybe in the micro sector but not in the macro sector. And so do current development economics and Western development practice actually only fight symptoms of something, of global inequalities, or does it really fight and try to understand global inequalities and its real causes? Or do we have a credibility problem maybe in development economics?
I always have to start, so no time to think. But I don't think we have a credibility problem in development economics, because development economics, despite my comment in the beginning of not being able to replicate stuff, is a science, and so it's quite comfortable. Like, we just try to understand the world, and that's fine. I like that. That's why I became a professor of development economics. Like, so I don't do development practice in that sense. I think there are different inequalities you can look at. So I really think the income differences and these global inequalities, that is not changed like with development policy at all. And I think, if one is honest, I don't think it's even trying it. But there are other inequalities that you can change, and that's the reason why I picked my field, which is health. We not only have like inequalities that some people have like an income that is like 20 times higher than others, we also have inequalities that some people like die 20 or 30 years earlier than others. And those are inequalities that you can change. And like public health interventions and improvement of the health sector in low-income countries like change those things. And I think that's quite a bit to for me that's a more important inequality. I mean, I rather have like 10 years more of life than like doubling my income.
I think this causes and symptom question is a really tricky question, because often I would not know how to make the difference between what's a cause and what's a symptom, and sometimes it's both. So if you think of health problems, for example, they are a consequence of poverty, but they are also a cause of future poverty, and so they sometimes are different to disentangle, difficult to disentangle, and I would fully agree that in some situations it's not even important to disentangle them. So if you say that that malnutrition is a consequence of poverty, then nevertheless it's good if you just deal with it. In other situations, let's say household income, it's a problem if you just deal with the symptom rather than creating jobs and addressing the cause, which could be unemployment or underemployment. So I really think that the answer to this depends. We have had, in recent years, we have really tried in development economics to go to the root causes, and I'm not really of development problems, and I'm not sure that was really successful. So we've had the discussion about institutions. So you need to get institutions right. You need to control corruption. All these are causes of poverty, and you need to address them. Some sub-Saharan African countries have lists of 400 causes of poverty that they would need to address. That's, for some countries, they need to address like 2 goals a day, fighting corruption and something else, which is a lot. And I'm not always sure if it makes sense to address these causes, or if you would rather try for policies, for local policies that could work, for example, in terms of creating industries, in terms of creating jobs. So, and that further, that makes the difference really difficult. But I think your question was heading to to another problem, which is, are we just trying to kind of to use development policy to do something without addressing real issues, which could be trade inequalities, unequal powers of negotiation at the global level and so forth. At this level, I would agree. I think there's a lack of willingness sometimes of rich countries to really engage with less powerful countries in order to reach fair agreements in terms of trade, for example. But this only applies to this field, and there's other fields where I think that treating symptoms is also an important thing.
Brief add-on. I'm not of the opinion that development aid or development cooperation at large was an outright failure throughout. By far not. And I don't underwrite to the well-known critical analyses that pretend to have arrived at that overarching result, especially in health and in education. These are probably the 2 most important fields. There have been, in a number of developing regions, enormous successes, and they can, to a large extent, directly linked to the cause of development cooperation. So it was not an outright failure, especially not in health. We are, along with our partners, terribly bad in improving entire health systems, and we are terribly bad still in improving entire education systems. But nevertheless, there were successes. And you have analyzed some of them. We are not good, to put it mildly, along with our partners, to generate or to trigger improvements in productive sectors. Productive sectors are far more difficult to move than social sectors. This is still a rule of thumb and an empirical result. So, as an overarching consequence, we have helped reducing poverty rates, for instance, in Africa, but absolute numbers are still growing, and convergence, which is measurable with developed regions, is still not making headway, which is an overarching measure for remaining inequality.
Thank you. We would now like to open our discussion, and just feel free to ask any questions to one or more of our guests. Are there questions? pass on the mic maybe.
Hello. I'll start directly with my first question, which revolves around the role of the government. Let's suppose we have a developing countries and it wants to further develop. So, which level of inequality within the society is advisable? And how much should the role of the government be? So should it tax? How much the taxation should be?
I don't know anything about these things.
Wir merken ja den Hintergrund der Frage, aber machen Sie mal.
So first of all, I don't think that there's one best answer. I mean, there's not one way in which societies should be, and one level of inequality, and one type of taxation, right? I mean, tax policy is embedded in a net of other policies and contexts. So, I mean, to give an answer to how should a country tax, I think that's maybe not an impossible question. With said, I think that taxes are very important because they create a link between citizens and state, because they create an independent budget. Countries that raise taxes and can use them to pay for different services are more independent from external aid than other countries. But I think my answer will rest on this rather general level, because specifically this is country specific. I think I would be a bit more, less hesitant in terms of inequality. I think, I'm not sure there could be, we don't have a country in the world where we say, there's too much equality, right? So we're having lots of countries where we're concerned with the levels of inequality, also on a global scale. So I think the reduction of inequality is really the concern of our times. I don't think that we have to be concerned with having too much equality right now. So I think we can just go for the reduction. Of course, you could think of a situation where we would just expropriate everybody and then have a socialist country. That's a different situation, but I think that's not what we're seeing. What we're seeing in the world. Inequality in terms of health, in terms of income, is in many regions maybe the severest problem. So I think we really need to address this, and then at further levels of income, then we should also think about equality of opportunity and all these things. And until we're at a satisfying level, I think this will take so much time, and then we can think about too much equality. You want to add something?
I mean, the gentleman obviously alluded to something new as well. In fact, you delivered or you quoted a wonderful add-on to our debate, because there is new insight on the relationship between inequality and growth, as well in advancing regions, and the sum of on both is that contrary to earlier beliefs, inequality beyond a certain point or beyond a certain measure of the Gini coefficient or whatever hampers growth, which was not mainstream knowledge until a couple of years ago, but now is becoming more and more it. That is what you basically said as well, I think.
So I agree, and one addition. So oftentimes policy focuses on growth, and we don't know how to make growth happen. But we do know very well how to reduce inequality. So again, it's a thing where we focus on the thing that we don't know, and we don't focus on the thing that we do know. I agree that looking at inequality is important, and for politicians to keep in mind what the level in the society is. Like, And I think like Trump was elected in the US because he was the only candidate that acknowledged that this is a problem. I'm not saying that he was giving the best answers, but he acknowledged that it is a problem, which the Democrats failed to do, and therefore these things happen. And we see that in many rich countries, like also in Germany, like the rise of like the right-wing parties is a consequence of like the mainstream is like not acknowledging that many people are left behind and they're angry, and that's like their way to express that.
Are there more questions concerning inequality, concerning something completely else? Could you pass on the mic? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would actually like to know, you only focus on growth all the time. Is there also degrowth possible? And if you have a look at climate change and all the other things which will most probably happen in the future, you only focus on growth, but it's not gonna work out.
Right. Don't focus on growth at all, actually. So most of my papers, I show that growth doesn't do all the good things that we think it does, and that we should focus on inequality more. I don't think that we should make degrowth happen, but I think we just should focus on different things. So I don't think we focus on growth.
I really don't have a good answer, because I think on the one hand that in many countries with a really low income level, there we really need growth. So I think people who advocate degrowth for the rich will also recognize this. Now, there are people doing simulations, kind of calculating what happens to the poorer countries and their income levels once you implement degrowth in the rich countries. And there are some people saying that the trickle-down effects, if you want to call it like that, of having degrowth in the rich world will be such that you will not be able to achieve raising incomes in the poor countries. So that's one dilemma. On the one hand, so you have this on the one hand. On the other hand, you have the perspective that if you do not get some control of CO2 emissions and so forth, then the first problem is not so important, because then the planet will not be alive anyway. So I think that's a real dilemma. I really don't have a good answer for this. I agree that that it's a problem and that we need to work on this, but it's a huge challenge. So that's all I can say right now.
Okay. More questions?
Hello. Okay, it's a question for you, Mr. Fowler. So you told us there's good knowledge about what works, but the policymakers are not listening to it. So my question would be, why do you think there's this discrepancy? Is it, are randomizers not really having enough good communication and with the policymakers, or do you think it's a problem with generalizability of those micro findings?
Well, I think this is a general problem of economics and science, like that. Many people that do good science don't care about communicating it to the public. And I think it's important to communicate findings to the public, and we try to do that, and we can't complain, get attention for that. Then how this knowledge translates into policy is a totally different question. But for the first part, I can just encourage all colleagues and all students, all scientists, to not only publish in the journals, but also try to reach out to the wider public with the findings. What policymakers then pick up, I don't know. But in development policy, what we always try to do with our research, for instance, next week I go to Indonesia, where we discuss the study findings with the local government and give full detail. And that's part of all studies we do, that we have this additional visit afterward, which is additional work, which is additional money, but I think that's important to do. The German policymakers, well, don't have a good answer for that. Like it's too much like that. It's like centrally decided what to do, and like maybe people also don't have the time to read that much and to compare, because when like knowledge gets to the media, just one point. And so this news report study shows that, like, I don't know, you should have more vitamin A in your diet and then you live like longer, or you shouldn't eat red meat, then you get cancer. Like, there are these one-point things, which usually are very useful. What is useful is like to have like a more comprehensive assessment of the literature and what is known, and making that like is very costly in terms of time, and I don't think the government, like policymakers, usually have the capacity, or maybe the interest, I don't know, to do that.
Would any of you like to
Okay, my question goes in another direction. I just heard that somehow like economic growth and environmental, like climate change, like that's a problem because of course we have to keep in mind climate change and CO2 emissions. My information may be outdated, but I thought mainstream economics is not like opposing these effects of economic growth and environmental protection. Like the environmental presence curves, I thought, is like postulating that it's first detrimental economic growth, but then it should get better as when a country gets richer. At least that's what I had in mind. And of course, like, because if we want to help African countries, we should keep in mind climate change, but can we not supplement our economic help with like environmental help? I don't know, because maybe, for example, the German corporation, development corporation in Brazil, is focusing on fighting climate change and the effects, like in Brazil, like for improving the use of renewable energies and more sustainable use of the forest there. So I'm just wondering, because I assume that most people think that's an adverse effect, economic growth, it has to be detrimental for the environment. But is that really the case, and can we not like work on both of those at the same time without neglecting the environment, like improving the economies of African countries without really doing bad for the environment?
Yeah, I think this is kind of what we mentioned already, but it is obviously one of these $1 million or $1 billion questions. If I bring the question back to Africa, because I'm an African and essentially the current situation is quickly described. Facing this double challenge of climate change, which is both adaptation and mitigation, it is clear that Africa, as all other developing regions, has a monumental task in terms of adaptation already. But as Africa is not contributing much to CO2 emissions, mitigation so far is not much of their concern. But if things change, and that is now where the question becomes increasingly relevant, if things change, if Africa gets more modern agriculture, if Africa gets an industry, I mentioned it, worth mentioning, then mitigation automatically becomes an issue as well, which in a way links obviously to the question of degrowth that we had. The growth that we then might help to trigger in Africa makes mitigation of climate change automatically a big issue, which at present it is not. And now the interesting thing is strategically, if in particular by leapfrogging some technologies in transport and in energy production, we can kind of deal with both. This is this challenge of green industrial policy, green transport systems, and so on. And the short answer probably is that there are, especially in energy production, some opportunities around, also at micro level, also at off-grid level, that would be apt to this idea of leapfrogging into energy systems which are more climate change resilient and so on and so forth. But it is very much an open strategic debate. We would probably all agree on that.
I would love to share the optimism about green growth, and I would love to share the optimism about reaching the two goals at the same time. I'm afraid that the evidence and the data are not very much in favor of this idea. For example, in terms of the environmental Kuznets curve, we're talking a lot about green growth in Germany. We're having the reputation of being the most innovative country in Europe, and so on. We don't have very high growth rates, and still the CO2 emissions are rising in absolute terms. You mentioned the case of Brazil. Brazil may be working on green policies with the GIZ and without. Still, Brazil, a country where many people don't have cars and have low income levels, Brazil has the annual CO2 output of Germany. Think of China. So China is, I think, maybe the most active country in the world in terms of non-fossil energy, and with the highest share of non-fossil energy, but in absolute terms, the CO2 production is still devastating. So I think what the evidence is showing is that we're having exponential environmental problems, and that we're not being able to keep pace. One idea would be to focus a little less on growth and to think more about standard of living and income levels to get a bit more independent of the economic growth of whole countries. But still, I'm afraid that this is not saving us. I mean, it's an open question, of course, as you said. At the moment, I'm afraid that the growth effects are outweighing any gains that we're making in terms of being more efficient in the industries and so forth.
Thank you. Is there another question? There is one.
Hello? Yeah. So you were mentioning the EU agricultural policies a few times and the contradiction to development aid in developing countries. So what do you think, how could this topic be addressed?
That's a good question for you.
I don't want to monopolize this thing. This is one of my pet topics, actually. The thing is simple. I mean, Sebastian Vollmer can answer to it as well, because in the trade negotiations between the EU and, in particular, Africa, the EU has consequently refused to talk about the effects of its own agricultural policy throughout the 12-14 years of negotiations, with an argument that this should better be dealt with in WTO ministerial grounds and so on. Leads to a different topic. What the African countries then have done, they have insisted that they can maintain a number of import restrictions, long-term ones, short-term ones, emergency ones, and they have put a number, mainly of agricultural products, on the so-called exclusion list. where they don't want to liberalize trade. This was there. And the thing and the debate stand there as they did at the time 10 years ago when you did your analysis. It is politically the same situation. And it is very, very unsatisfying that the situation is still there. And the political challenge, which should be in fact corroborated by good economic analysis, is to convince the European Commission, also DG Agri, that is the Director General for Agriculture in Brussels, more than any other, and obviously the important governments of the EU, to finally cross this river and say, okay, in your view, dear partners, what would be the 1-2 most important changes to the common agricultural policy that would reduce the damage done in Africa? I mean, there is a debate which is more complicated than it was in the beginning, because most of agricultural subsidies are now called decoupled and are direct payments by hectare, not by production, let alone exports. But in fact, most experts agree, I do as well, that there is still some export subsidy effect, which has then an onslaught in Africa. And making actually the current EU Common Agricultural Policy reform a subject in conjunction with the African partners and say, hey, for instance, for cotton subsidies or for milk, where we have no subsidy but direct payments still, what would be the 1-2 major changes that would also alleviate and reduce the tensions in the trade negotiations between the two regions? That would be enormously helpful, but we are far from it. There are some guys in DG DEFCO, that is the developmental guys in Brussels, who are in favor of it, but this is a clear minority. I suppose this is a background to your question. Kind of? Did I miss the question?
Yeah. No.
Oh.
But I think the thing is much more complicated than that, because I think getting rid of all export subsidies, like either direct subsidies or like indirect through like these hectare payments, is also dangerous, because in Africa there are people that produce food and there are people that buy food, and making food more expensive will hurt people that buy food. And therefore just getting rid of the subsidies like without like a clear strategy in mind will hurt these people quite hard. And in the beginning, I think this effect might even outweigh like the benefits. Yeah? I think in the long run I agree that like the agriculture will build up, but it's much more complicated than that. So when we think about, we forget this effect on the food prices. And rising food prices hurt poor people quite substantially. So therefore, if you want to change the EU agricultural policy, which I would support, you still have to think about this effect and how you want to deal with it. Because if you don't, then you immediately hurt many people.
You want to return to export subsidies, if I understand you correctly.
No, I'm not. I'm just saying, like, getting rid of all these EU policies like will hurt people immediately, whereas like the benefits will maybe occur a few years later. And because we have like net consumers of food and we have net producers of food. And in the long run, like you will benefit the net producers of food, and maybe in the long run also bring down the food prices again. But the immediate effect is that food prices go up, and the net consumers of food are hurt. And the net consumers of food are often very poor people. And therefore, like changing the EU agricultural policy without a complementary policy dealing with that is not advisable.
Excuse me, one question. Do you mean net food producers and consumers in Africa?
Yes.
Yeah, and prices will rise from the domestic production or from EU production?
Well,
or general?
and first, like, there's one price for the food items, and that will immediately go up. And then maybe once like the domestic production is in good enough shape to serve the market, because currently it's crippled, like from the EU policy, and it will take some time to build up. And until it's built up, like the prices will increase and people will suffer from that. So I think if you propose that change, like you can't propose it without like this transition phase in between.
If there aren't any more pressing questions, I would like to close the discussion now.
So I had a question for Mr. Archer. A couple of days ago, Paul Kagame, the former president, was elected as the chairman of the African Union. And although he's a controversial figure, he's known for his efficiency. So I wanted to ask whether you think that it's going to increase the importance of the African Union in terms of bargaining power and international trade maybe, and also development in general.
I'm grateful for this question, just to bring the point home, I disagree to a large extent with what Sebastian said before, although this need for transitional measures, this is where we could be in agreement, but this is far too close to the EU Commission, also in analytical terms. You make it the next controversy, I would love to. So on Kagame, I have it here from I bought the Taz this morning, and where Paul Kagame is handed over the signs of being the president of the EU. This is important. The guy is not a democrat, he is a dictator, but he is a benevolent dictator, as the term goes in theory. That is a guy who has a clear developmental view for both Rwanda and for Africa, to put it very briefly. But I know Rwanda sufficiently well, and I'm sufficiently often there to say that, despite all the deficits that are clearly there in terms of democracy. Now, and that links finally again to our debate. What Kagame wants to push is the so-called Agenda 2063, to which is also the Marshall Plan, theoretically, that is superficially linked. And at the center of this plan that Kagame wants to push at the AU is the integration of Africa, vis-à-vis traveling for all Africans by open frontiers, a common African passport, abolition of job permits that hamper this, and duty-free trade. That is making the African Union in its entirety a free trade area. This is called the project of the Continental Free Trade Area, which he wants to push during his term at the presidency. And now for economists, the interesting thing is, particularly related to trade in goods and in services, is this a realistic project? Is this a realistic project? That is here, this visa-free traveling for all Africans and so on. There are some measures in this agenda, one simply cannot be against it. But for the continental free trade area, in fact, replacing the regional communities that are now partnering also with the EU in these controversial agreements by a large continental free trade area is far more complicated to judge economically than some of the rest. And in fact, there is also a controversy relating to the economic prospects of such a continental free trade area. Unfortunately, we do not have the time to go deeper into the details, but some of what we have mentioned here would pop up again and we would give you a proper answer on that.
And I actually would like to continue the discussion, and we actually can because we have reserved a table at Café Botanic, and you're all very welcome to come, and our discussants said yes, and they will come too, so we can continue there. But for now, I would like to thank our discussants for their insights into their research practice and also development practice, and I would like to thank you for coming here and listening.